All right.
Hey, I'm
Welcome.
David Forlow, a current board member at the History Center of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff.
Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your book. Why don't you tell me about how this project started? How did you start working on the Scots of the North Shore?
So the shortest version I could tell you, I was born in Scotland and raised in the U.S., moved here when I was a little boy by an intensely proud Scottish father. So I got a nonstop weekly Scottish history lesson, drove me nuts. But like all good little boys, I became my dad. Fast forward 20 odd years, I met a gentleman who was the head of a Scottish charity in Chicago at a cultural fest. And I signed up for his Illinois Scots history newsletter and discovered he knew all the stuff my dad taught me, but he also knew about local Scots. Another 20 years later, I moved to Lake Bluff. And it wasn't until I was here a few years, I began to notice that many of these same names from the Scottish charity to which I belonged were around here in this area on buildings, gravestones, and just well-known families. And I finally made the connection that there was a whole lot of Scots around here. Dug through at the History Center and discovered bingo, that just because people hadn't, I think, looked at it from that point of view, I figured out that we had 6, 7 Scots who lived on the same block, 2 doors apart. It wasn't an accident. They knew one another, were friends with each other, and picked here to live on purpose.
Interesting. And so you very kindly have decided to donate the proceeds from this to the History Center, and we're very thankful for that. So clearly it's an act of, love for this book. You're not trying to make money off of it. And you published through Acadia. So how was that experience?
It was interesting. So I've never done a book before, and so the historian at the Illinois St. Andrew Society helped. Arcadia in some ways makes it easier, but others are it's very formulaic. The pictures have to be a certain size, scanned at a certain resolution, a fixed number of words per caption. So it made it easier in some respects because you just had to follow their format, but difficult in others in that they would reject some photos. It seemed sort of for no good reason, and there were some cool stories that didn't make it in the book and others that did. But generally it was easier because there was a formula to follow.
Very good. We'll be working on a virtual exhibit that goes with it. So hopefully some of the stories that didn't make it into the book make it into the virtual exhibit and something that's accessible by, our audience online. Of all the stories, and I know that you had dozens and dozens, what is the one that stands out in your mind the most?
So a poor kid makes good I love stories like that. I like biographies when I was a child. So one of the stories is a kid named James King, who was born in a hut, literally a hut in the mountains of Scotland, where his father was a gardener, manual labor guy, dirt floor, 5 kids, dad could barely read and write. And in Scotland, you had to go to school till you were 14, but at that point it was no longer law. And once each child turned 14, they were essentially told out of the house, go find a job. And he became a caretaker. He was a shepherd boy. He worked in a factory. And at one point, a relative approached him and said, would you deliver some cattle to Illinois? And he accompanied 5 cows and a bull on a train from Aberdeen to Glasgow, a ship from Glasgow to Liverpool, where there was a 3 or 4 day layover. And he took the pay he was fronted and he went to the bookstore and bought books. That's what he did with his money. He wanted to make himself better. And at the bookstore, he met a woman and they stayed in contact. And Liverpool to Quebec City through the Erie Canal, round Lake Michigan, finally to Waukegan, finally to a train, finally to Lake Forest where he stayed. He chopped wood 6 days a week, 10 hours a day for $1 a day. But he read and read and read and read and eventually became the city manager of Lake Forest, where he served for 35 years. And Market Square was designed by an architect, of course, but James King was essentially the general contractor behind that. So I walked past Market Square, I think, of James King. And the cool thing was, I think, he reinvented himself. So here he became James Ferguson Blakey King. He just made up 2 middle names that sounded cool. Back in Scotland, he was James King from the dirt hut, whose dad could barely read and write.
Wow. So when did he come over? What year was he here?
Late 1800s. So one of the earliest residents in Lake Forest was James Anderson, who was from Aberdeen, and that's where Black Angus cows originate. So if you ever have an Angus burger or Angus steak, those cattle were first brought to Lake Forest. They were the first place in the U.S. And they would send over back home and have young men bring loads of cattle, and several of them stayed. So our Robertson's menswear was because of the Robertson family bringing a load of cattle. Our in Lake Forest, the head of the streets and sanitation was Alex Kelly. He brought over a load, and James King was another one. He ended up staying and becoming our city clerk.
So that's the first wave of migration that comes in. There's a second one, right, that brings in wealthier people. I know that we've got some fairly well-to-do
Yep.
families that come in.
Yeah, so really, probably the first wave was early on when Lake County was first opened, and there was a few Scots that came that farmed on the west side. And then, yeah, the early wave, Lake Forest was just, it was a school, right, and the academy, and then some working folks, farmers and whatnot. But then, yes, as it became fashionable, the next wave came in, and that's interesting to me as well, that there were a lot of wealthy Scottish families that decided to make Lake Forest their home as well. The McCormicks, the Armours, the Stewarts and Douglases who founded Quaker Oats, Wilson, who was Wilson Meats, Wilson Sporting Goods, all chose Lake Forest to make their homes. One other cool thing I thought of all this is you look through the old census records, for example, two of the members of the Douglas family lived next door to one another on Green Bay Road, father and son. Son was friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald at school. But so the son was then two generations from someone Scots born, but between those two households, two enormous estates, there was 14 or 15 household servants, cooks, and whatnot, and virtually all of them were Scottish born. So it was clear to them many years later that they still identified with that background and were going out of their way to hire and help people.
Wow. Yeah. So chain migration, which was a standard form of bringing people in, was
Yep.
going back to the old country and bringing people
Yep.
you knew in because you could trust them and you knew them. And you
Yeah.
knew how you'd benefited from American society. So what were the tools that really helped you in doing the research? Because you dug back more than 150 years in history. So where were you able to find some of this information?
So there is a Scottish American History Museum. It's not much of a museum. It's a couple cabinets, but they do have a closet worth of information. So the Illinois St. Andrew Society was a Scottish charity founded in Chicago, 1845. Chicago population, I think less than 10,000 at the time. Scots got together and formed a charity. And many of those charity members helped found Lake Forest. So they have fairly extensive records, but they lost them in the Chicago fire and kind of rebuilt from there. And probably the one incident that really kind of set this in motion is I did a tour, gosh, had to be close to 20 years ago. It was an architecture tour in Lake Forest, self-guided. They gave you information to read about each house. It was mostly about architecture. What I noticed, though, is at the bottom of each page, it said, who built the house? And of the 6 homes, what I saw were 5 distinctly Scottish names. And I got a hold of the Scottish American Museum and said, all right, who recognize any of these names? And they were all members of the Illinois St. Andrew Society. So not just Scottish, but members of this Scottish charity. And that kind of just set things in motion where that led one to the next to the next. And in terms of tools, the other one is just the internet. It's amazing, right? That reaching out and asking for help. Who knows this family or that family? I got emails and photographs sent to me from Australia, New Zealand, British Columbia, Scotland, of course, England, Ireland, and at least 20 states coast to coast in the US where people heard about it and said, for example, James King, that's my great-grandfather. I have photos of him holding me as a baby. Let me tell you his story, and here's all the documentation. So it's just cool. You ask for help, and it flows in.
It's amazing. What is the one big takeaway you want people to know from this project? Like if you were to create sort of a theme or an overview, what is it about this book?
So I just think it's important to honor the people who came before you. Again, I've always liked biographies when I was a kid. So you hear about a James King who becomes James Ferguson Blakey King. When he retired, there was a huge ceremony the city put on. They gave him a gold star to thank him for his 35 years of service. He's a name no one will ever know in town, or most people won't. I walk past Market Square and I think, well, that's James King. He was one of the 2 people that got that done.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think the chain migration thing is really interesting as well, that people just don't end up here, or often don't end up here. There's a reason behind it. And it was cool to meet some people or to contact with some people. And I said, I have no idea what my grandfather, why he came to Lake Forest. And then you find out he's from a tiny village in the south of Scotland, and 8 other people in town were all from the same tiny village, all working for the same farmer. It's like they didn't just end up here. That was exactly as you said. So I found out from many of them, their passage was paid for a year's worth of labor. So there's people who came to Lake Forest, where you think of, wow, wealthy Lake Forest. Like, no, there's people who came here and
As
pledged
indentured,
a year,
yeah, they
6
were
days a
indentured
week.
servants. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not that long ago, literally early 1910 or thereabouts, that people were desperate coming here to say, I just want a new life, and I'll do what it takes.
That's amazing. And so for you, I mean, this is a pretty personal journey because, again, this is your family's story as well. So when did your family come over? Were
So
you?
1966, so we moved to Canada first because as a British citizen, it was very easy to move. And at that time, the city where we lived, Glasgow, was it was a former shipbuilding capital of the world. It was the second city of the empire, but really kind of started to fall in tough times. My father's father was a coal miner. Other grandfather was a night watchman, had been in the Navy forever. He was a boxer on the side for cash. But my dad decided, all right, let's pick up and move. Canada was the easy move, and then we moved to Detroit. And sort of the same story, knew nobody. My dad had a couple $100 in the pocket, had a job, had to register for the draft, although we had a really low draft number because you had 2 little kids and he was 25 at the time. But I think about it after I had kids myself, like, all right, what would it take just to pick up and move halfway around the world where you know nobody and you have a couple $100 in your pocket? Especially coming to Detroit at that time. I remember you could see smoke from our apartment window. It was right in the midst of after Dr. King was assassinated, and it was an interesting time to pick up and move. And if that was considered a step up in the world for my folks, to give you an idea kind of where they
Started. Yeah.
But my parents did well, worked really hard, and I think very, very, very many years later, my dad was in terminal cancer. We had a lot of these great talks, so there was some blessing in disguise there. But I remember saying that to him, boy, it took a lot of courage to pick up and move. And he said, Dad, I didn't worry about it. I knew we would make it. And he said the thing that worried him is he worried his kids wouldn't know about Scotland. That's why every week we're going to get pounded in with this, factoid lesson where he drove me nuts.
And so you're not an only child, right? There were other siblings?
I've got an older brother who of course, came here with me. And then a younger sister was born after we arrived.
And have they held on to sort of the Scottish personality traits, the Scottish pride?
Yeah, I think me a little more than the other two, but yes. So we would go back. We'd go back on vacation when we could afford it, get a charter flight every couple or 3 or 4 years, and relatives would come visit. So it's interesting how it passes on to some, not the others. I have 2 boys. One has got a mild interest in it. The other has caught the disease, and he's full on. Now that he's out of college, working himself, he and a bunch of college buddies all went to Scotland for 2 weeks together and palled around. So it just depends. And it's interesting, right? So my family tree, all my grandparents are Scottish, but you go back another generation, I've got English great-grandmother and great-grandfather, and the great-grandfather's last name was Docherty, which is very Irish. So at some point, there's some Irish, some Scottish, some English. You just kind of...
Right, it sort of melds together. Have you done the DNA test to do like Ancestry or any of those?
Yeah, so when you first do it, there's not a lot of samples. It gives you kind of a rough this and that. So it was cool that I had, I think, 2% from North Africa. Now there's more samples. I am like England, Scotland, Ireland, and a little Scandinavian, and that's 99% of me. So a little disappointed to find that out.
All pudding.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to talk about that I didn't ask a question on?
No, the book was not a commercial endeavor. It's about giving back, I think. We collected over 2,000 photos that came in from around the world. We're giving all those to the History Center. All the author royalties go to the History Center. And right now, we've donated to you guys a supply of books. So people buy a book, you're making a donation to the History Center. And we can't hold events right now, so we need your help.
Well, thank you for that. And we are very appreciative, both for the contributions to the archives as well as the contributions of the books to the museum. Thank you so much for this interview, and I look forward to taking a look at the book when it gets in.
Well, thank you. Thanks.